So my name is Reginald Jackson. I teach in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures here at the University of Michigan, working on pre-modern Japanese literature and performance primarily. And I have the pleasure today of introducing a friend and former colleague, Phil Kaffen. So I met Phil, actually, I got to know him during his time when he was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Chicago some years back. And I think it's important to say that you know, he was a godsend to our program there, and particularly in terms of the way that he was such a generous colleague, but also so kind and generous to his students and the graduate students in particular. They adored him because he spent a lot of time, he went above and beyond the call of duty to teach them inside of seminars and outside of seminars. And I think I would just want to start by saying that because I think that that generosity intellectually and also socially, kind of interpersonally, was something that I was really impressed with Phil, and why I kind of wanted to invite him to kind of share some of that with you guys today. So what I appreciate about Phil's work, beyond its keen attention to detail, you know, linguistically as well as analytically, is that he also has a really strong kind of set of political and ethical commitments. So he's not just in this to tell you smart things about Japanese cinema. He actually has concerns that actually far exceed Japan as a region or as an idea, and is really interested in trying to think about ways, concepts like maybe vulnerability, refuge, visibility, to connect his work to other regions and to other discourses, other conversations happening in other places. And I think far too few of us as academics tend to think in those terms, and so it's great to see someone that actually has a commitment there that's not just about sounding sexy or of the moment. Phil's research and teaching interests revolve around the role of the image in modern societies, from intersections of art and technology and optical media to theoretical reflections on imagination and representation, to the politics of surveillance and security. And I think that the last part is something that he'll be talking to us about today. His primary research field is Japan, but he's published essays on bodies in urban space in documentary and fiction film, and on violence in cinema in the 1970s. He's currently working on a book project tentatively titled Immediacy and Refuge, Rethinking the Place of Cinema in Japan. And today he's going to give us a talk entitled Visibility and Vulnerability in Japanese Cinema. Please join me in welcoming Phil Kaffen.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to come out, for organizing. Thank you all for coming. I am interested in kind of questions of sovereignty in relationship to media, media aesthetics, visual media especially. And sovereignty is this kind of tricky word with a long, kind of complicated history. But I think of it in somewhat simple terms as just a relationship between subjects or citizens mediated by a kind of sovereign or ruler. It often implies some kind of autonomy. And I want to think about it especially now in terms of security, which I think of as a kind of contemporary mode of sovereignty that's difficult for me to grasp. So this is kind of an effort for me to try to do that. And I'm going to start by talking about some recent writings on security as an affective infrastructure, one that poses difficulties for anyone trying to picture it or make it visible. And I think what makes it difficult is it's hard to consider security wholly apart from ourselves, from our own fears and vulnerability. And I want to ask whether cinema or other media might make possible an exploration of this sense of vulnerability, under what conditions and with what consequences. To do so, I'm going to work through some examples from Japanese cinema and media more broadly, to highlight what I call cinematic reciprocity as one possible means of engaging our vulnerability. So sovereignty. Ever since Hobbes, we might say that sovereignty is based on a kind of projection or an image. Like Descartes, Hobbes wrote on optics and was quite familiar with the then contemporary science, i.e. mid-17th century, on optics. and thought about it considerably. And some people have argued that the famous frontispiece of his book of political philosophy, Leviathan, is actually supposed to be a kind of optical illusion. In an intriguing essay on this image, the philosopher Giorgio Agamben asks, where does the Leviathan stand? This is an interesting problem, both literally and figuratively, with this image. And he points out, I know I'm supposed to stay close to this, but I'm going to move for a second. He points out, and people have tried to draw this before, that if you try to imagine where the Leviathan is actually standing, it seems like he is just floating in space, like some kind of phantasm or something like that. So people have tried to do this before, but even if we look at it from this kind of regular perspective, we can see that actually the Leviathan is standing beyond the city, beyond the mountains, completely outside this kind of realm of the polis. And so in that sense, the Leviathan seems to be standing completely outside. And yet, when we look very closely, we can see that the body of the Leviathan, of the sovereign, of the Commonwealth, is constituted by the bodies of the people, right? And they're all turned towards him. Actually, in an earlier draft of this image, they're facing out and towards us. But what's curious about that is either way, they're facing the sovereign and the Commonwealth. And this is something that I think is really interesting about this image. In other words, this depiction of sovereignty, perhaps the most famous one we have, seems to suggest that it exists both in this kind of distant image and this figure far removed from us, and at the same time that we are a part of it, that it is already within us. We are already within it. And we might recall as well that, that his book, Leviathan, does not begin with a discussion of contracts, commonwealths, and Christianity, but actually with the discussion of sense and image. Sovereignty then is not solely out there in the figure of the monster, but also in our sense and imagination of the world. Quite simply, our relationship to sovereignty is one of being a part. But what is it that holds the multitude together? Hobbes's answer was clear: fear. And fear is a big part of what I want to talk about today. I think it's an extremely important thing to discuss and is behind my kind of thinking about vulnerability. It's out of fear that the multitude unites by a covenant of a unified will to constitute the Commonwealth, a monster, and perhaps a figure of dread, an automaton, an artificial soul. These are some of the ways that Hobbes talks about it. In contemporary writings on power and security, fear continues to hold sway. The works of people like the anthropologist Joseph Masco, the theorist Brian Masumi, for example, point out these new dimensions of power, and they tend to emphasize affect as a kind of sensory relationship. To consolidate a little bit and paraphrase, Masco, for example, argues that it's by mobilizing an unknown future threat within the present that what he calls national security affect provides the infrastructure of our contemporary moment, creating a sort of militarized citizenship. I like this idea of a kind of affective infrastructure. I tend to think of infrastructure in very sort of material terms, as a kind of logistics and way of bringing things in and out of a sort of milieu. But thinking about that in these kind of slightly more structural terms that touch on sense and affect is a compelling idea to me. And we might also think about it, for example, with regard to even recent efforts in Japan to enact a proactive pacifism, sekkyoku-teki heiwa shugi, and this kind of expression from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs about the security environment surrounding Japan is becoming increasingly severe. When I see this kind of expression, I just find it odd. It's as if the words themselves have become loose. What does it mean to say a security environment? This, I think, is really curious. I want to draw a little bit on the ecologist Imanishi Kinji, who wrote many, many years ago that we share a kind of metabolic relationship with our environment as a kind of world of living things. It's a relationship of incessant exchange. We take the environment into ourselves, release parts of it out. So he said, for example, that our digestive tract is part of the environment. I kind of like this idea. We're not wholly removed from it, so that the idea of making a security environment visible is a real challenge. Another difficulty is that the term fear tends to refer to an emotion that we already know, but its operations within us are something that takes place before we even recognize it as fear. This is something that Brian Masumi really emphasizes a lot. It's a sort of pre-subjective or maybe intuitive kind of sense. If so, how do we engage or illuminate this? Insofar as our wills and fear are part of a sovereign security, this poses numerous problems. We have to direct our attention both to that which is without and at the same time that which is within. But this is not easy either. When we turn the gaze to ourselves, for example, who is the operator of that gaze? Who is in control of the gaze that we turn? We are. And if so, already then we are outside the sensory affective dimension, looking down upon it from on high. We can easily wind up in that sense self-policing or self-surveilling. And that is to say, if we can be secure in our analysis of the world, in the name of some kind of critique, we can do it also at a deeper level with ourselves in a way that leaves us secure, not open or exposed to anything. In this sense, I think we have to figure out a way to illuminate multiple dimensions of security at once. So what could cinema or visual media do? In some ways, this seems like a real challenge. In most ways, I would argue it seems like a real challenge. Certainly, cinema and media play an important role in all kinds of discipline, as we know, in closed-circuit television, for example, in surveillance, and all of this. But really, today I'm interested in just kind of the structural, technological, architectural way in which images are of a piece with sovereignty and security. As Nakamura Hideyuki has put it, cinema itself is already a kind of panopticism. It is seeing without being seen. In this sense, a kind of voyeurism and a kind of surveillance. If so, the act of watching a movie not only ensures our own safety and security, but also can implicate us in a gaze of power and violence. This is a problem that film theory, for example, confronted for decades in its critique of the gaze and the subject. While slightly less confrontational, Stanley Cavell has argued that cinema takes responsibility or care out of our hands entirely by presenting us with a past world, one that he says, we don't just look at cinema, we look out at it, as if from within ourselves we look out at something, protected by a kind of mask or shield. In this way, it seems to echo John Hamilton's etymological analysis of security as securitas, the removal of care, whether carefree or careless. Cinema remains an apparatus of security insofar as the sense of the I or we who watches it is never broached. We remain observers. According to Cavell, cinema thus merely makes automatic our natural mode of perception. This is difficult to argue with. But today, what I want to do is draw attention to a structure of vulnerability that I see in a particular kind of shot that I'll refer to as cinematic reciprocity. Very simply, this is a shot of when somebody looks directly at the camera, and that's what I want to talk about today. Cinematic reciprocity engages our intuitive relationship to media images, even as it's never finally reducible to an immediate exchange or simple economy. My wager is that this intuitive relationship can help to make visible our place in the affective infrastructure of security, to highlight its force. So let me turn to some examples that might help illuminate this. 1925 saw the appearance of Orochi, directed by Futogawa Buntaro and starring and produced by Bando Tsumasaburo, Bansima, an extremely famous actor at the time. It was actually the first work that he produced through his own production company, Bansima Productions, and a sort of early example maybe of an independent production in Japan. Although this film is quite famous now and widely regarded as one of the great period films in Japanese film history, it actually did not really impress critics that much at the time, apart from this final scene. I've seen this scene dozens of times. I still find it a really striking and remarkable scene. The dynamism of the camera work, the speed, and even Bando Tsumasaburo's own body, which looks like it's being electrocuted by live wires, I just find really, really striking, of course. But I'm also interested in the ways that the film is caught up in a kind of impulse to revelation in relationship to a security environment. The film was heavily censored. 1,400 feet of film were cut by censors. I'm not entirely sure, actually, about the format or projection speed, which could vary a little bit, but it could be up to maybe 20 minutes, something like that. The title was also changed from Outcast, Buraikan, to Serpent, Orochi. The censorship might have been severe, but it was not isolated. It was systematic and legal. Indeed, a major new law was passed the same year that centralized all censorship at the federal level within the Department of the Interior. Its first article, the law's first article, concerned public security, including any defaming of the imperial system, nation, or society. In addition, this new film censorship law passed only months removed from the notorious peace preservation law, Qian Yijiho. The aims of that law were to protect private property and to defend the koktai. Koktai is a word that is often translated as a kind of national essence and refers usually to some kind to the imperial system. But recent research also indicates that the term was often opaque even to the people who were trying to enforce it. Nonetheless, this opacity might have lent it even more power. The law was used to police thought, to surveil, imprison, torture, and kill leftists, anarchists, other radicals, including ultimately even right-wing radicals. The close proximity of these two laws, though, their intimacy and intertwining, is what concerns me today and here. It seems to indicate that cinema at a certain level was a key site of security at the time, that the securing of the image itself was necessary for the securing of society at large. The effect of these laws in cinema, which were championed by many in the industry, were deleterious indeed. Aaron Giroux has pointed out how they led to the internalization of structures of power and police within the spectator. In other words, a kind of discipline. The film text itself became isolated and closed, its meaning intact and no longer negotiable. Kitara Akihiro has argued at the same time that by removing, for example, the benchi and changing the law, the image alone, representation, became the sole criterion of critique. The dissonance, frisson, and vitality of cinema as experience was extinguished. Thus, after 1925, cinema seems to have settled into a site of containment and obedience under the terms of sovereignty with a disciplined viewer. It is out of this that the system of Japanese cinema is born within an environment of security, and orochi is a product of that environment. The sense of security is also a factor in the diegesis or narrative world. Orochi has not so much a plot as a problem. It's not really a story, actually, in the film. The problem is announced right at the beginning of the film. In fact, before we see any image at all, it's on a title that's given to us. Not all of those, it says, who wear the name of villain are evil men. Not all who are respected are worthy of the name. Many are those who wear a false mask of benevolence to hide their treachery. The entire film, then, is about that problem. This problem of a kind of unmasking or making visible in two senses. The main character, Heizaburo, feels constantly misjudged and ostracized by corrupt authoritarian power. He therefore has to prove himself as good and also expose or reveal the corruption of those in power. But this doesn't go smoothly at all. In fact, it keeps failing. Why is that? Because every time he tries to pull away the mask to reveal the corruption of those who wear masks or show himself as good, he actually finds himself implicated in violence, until he finally comes to realize that he actually is the monster that people say he is. We can see this actually in the previous year's Gyakuryu, Countercurrent. Same director, same star, same crew, and same story. At the very end of the film, he sets out to kill his nemesis, and he does so. He also inadvertently kills the love of his life at the same time, right? Very kind of melodramatic element. But what I like about this and find most striking is the framing of this shot, where although we know in terms of the narrative that his nemesis is down here, he seems to be sticking the sword into the frame of the image, right? As if he's trying to, in an act of revealing, get beyond the image somehow, to cause some kind of violence, to break it open. And it's here, I think, also that we can consider the very famous analysis of the frame and the mask by André Bazin. Bazin points out that cinema actually has no frame. He says the screen is not a frame like that of a picture, but a mask, which allows only a part of the action to be seen. When a character moves off screen, we accept the fact that he's out of sight, but he continues to exist in his own capacity at some other place in a decor which is hidden from us. There are no wings to the screen. There could not be without destroying its specific illusion, which is to make of a revolver or of a face the very center of the universe. It's here, I think, that we can see how the mask is playing this kind of double role, and the idea of getting beyond the image implicates cinema itself. Unfortunately, I mean, in these cases, each time he tries to do it, as I said, he gets himself further into the morass, into a world of security and violence. From within a security environment, it becomes very difficult to make visible the source of this power. But let me show another clip from Orochi again and return to it that happens earlier in the film that's frequently overlooked, but I think is really important and compelling. In this scene, which occurs somewhat late in the film, the hero is about to set upon a young woman, one for whom he felt romantically inclined, as with the earlier film, and he threatens her and becomes this kind of monster.
三郎の耳元で悪鬼がささやく。平三郎、行け。お願いです。堪忍してください。お願いです。平三郎、行け。世の中は悪ばかりだ。どこに正しいものがある。己の欲するまま。奪い取るのだ。行け、平三郎。
We can see again how the space of the room, the architecture is commensurate with the space of the image, as if she's trying to get out, but is trapped within it.
この二つの声が平三郎の耳元で叫んでいる。お願いです。堪忍してください。目にいっぱい涙を浮かべている娘の姿を見ると。平三郎の心が乱れる。そこにまた悪鬼の声が。平三郎、どうした？世の中に正しいことはない。行け、平三郎。
Okay, good. So, I think this is a really striking and compelling shot and sequence that people don't really talk about, but this is, in other words, the kind of shot of cinematic reciprocity that I want to discuss, where he seems to be looking directly out at us. He hears the voice of the devil, and suddenly the framing shifts very slightly. If we go back and we look at it, for example, initially we can see that he seems to be looking at her. But then, with this very, very slight shift, it's no longer her, but clearly looking out. She's no longer the object of address. It would seem we are the object of address, and he's saying there's no good in this world. At the same time, as he comes through this extreme close-up, we can see just this moment of hesitation. Within this kind of element of monstrosity, there's a slight vulnerability. It says, 心が乱れる, right? His heart or his spirit is confused, entangled, this kind of idea. And he backs up very, very slowly in this kind of moment of maybe some kind of recognition, some kind of realization. This gaze outward becomes important, I think. He comes face to face with that mask at a certain level. We come face to face with him, maybe, but mediated in complicated ways. It's worth noting that although the film, both of the films, expose the character as violent, as caught up in the violence he's trying to condemn, they also show that he's not wrong, that those people in power, that system of security does in fact exist. In this sense, cinema seems to allow for a certain exposure affecting all people involved, the characters, the world, the truth, and the viewers. If we are to some extent exposed at some level, addressed directly in this shot of cinematic reciprocity, this still needs further investigation. To be sure, a lot could be said much more about this film and also about period film in general, so much of which, I can't say all of it by a long shot, sorry, but is concerned with this problem of deception and trying to reveal some kind of truth, dealing with appearances. But today I want to focus on this specifically, and I want to focus on it in a couple of ways. I don't want to talk about it in terms of the face. Many people talk about that kind of shot as just the face. That turns it into a sort of object for us to look at. And I'm not interested in sort of somebody breaking the fourth wall in a very sort of strategic way or something like generally the news where we expect it to be the case. What's interesting to me is the tension when we sort of don't expect it. Let me draw, I'm going to come back to Chris Marker multiple times in this talk, and I'm going to show this brief clip from Sans Soleil, his kind of poetic documentary from 1982, shot largely in Guinea-Bissau and in Japan.
Frankly, have you ever heard of anything stupider than to say to people, as they teach in film schools, not to look at the camera?
So pauses here. He uses freeze frame, I think, to accentuate this. We get a sense of the fact that this is a sort of taboo. People aren't supposed to look at the camera generally. And we get this kind of refusal of that idea. This is something that Marker was intensely aware of. There's not a sort of attempt to reveal something out there, but almost more of a sense of exposing himself before someone. We have a sense of maybe some kind of exchange, but if so, this idea of a kind of encounter that can't necessarily be predicted is one that might intervene in our own self-security in complicated and contradictory ways. Let me draw from another film, Good Morning, directed by Ozu Yasujiro and released in May of 1959. It's often dismissed as a light work by Ozu. In fact, the scholar Yonoha Jun just recently published a book in which he says Good Morning is the only Ozu film in the post-war period that does not address the war. Actually, I think that this is a debatable claim. But today, I want to look at it in sort of other terms. I think that the film brings together a complex array of issues involving sovereignty, domestic space, protest, and the new medium of television. The story largely concerns two boys who stage a protest against their parents, and there are two components to it. One, they want a TV. That's the most important. They want to have a television. And two, they don't like the ways that the adult world is full of a kind of senseless language that the title of the film embodies, Good Morning, Ohio, the kind of thing that people just sort of say mindlessly to one another, and they make fun of this a lot. So I want to look at one particular scene in the film that takes place in school when the younger brother is in the classroom. The two brothers have sworn a vow of silence until they can get their television. Okay, so this is the symbol that he's kind of developed with his brother. He can't sort of break it, and he can't speak. Of course, people have for many, many years looked at Ozu kind of in these terms. For example, when we look closely, we realize that she looks directly at us and he does not. And people often point out this idea of mismatched eye lines as a sort of break in continuity that's in violation of classic Hollywood cinema norms. Always they have to enforce continuity, right, all the time. Ozu did not do this, kind of consistently. So we have that. We also have the language game that's another kind of rupture, where the end syllable of one word is supposed to link to the first syllable of the other, and each time they get it wrong, right? Including the sticking out the tongue. And finally, we have Isamu's sort of gesture here. It's not a radical gesture. It's not something confrontational, but it shifts the entire field, I think, at some level. I don't, in that sense, want to return this to the idea that this is what Ozu does, which puts it back in the realm of sovereignty of the director. I want to think about it in relationship to that broader sense of cinematic reciprocity, to get it out of the dimension of a kind of auteur. But I also want to focus on this scene of protest. We might recall, for example, that when we see this scene and when we are looked at by the teacher, right? She keeps asking, what? And there's not a kind of response. We're caught in between a kind of action and reaction as it's happening. And the act of protest might also remind us that just as Orochi appeared loosely in tandem, for example, with the peace preservation law and film censorship, Good Morning appears loosely in tandem with the US-Japan Security Treaty, or AMPO. The film is not usually talked about in these terms. Why? One reason may be that the protest feels wholly incommensurate with what we think of when we consider the AMPO protests. Nonetheless, I want to argue that it's significant as a confrontation with security. The other reason that it might not be associated with it is because it appeared a year before the major upheavals took place, which a lot of them were in May and June of 1960, even though protests had extended well beyond that. Only a couple months before, however, the wedding, the imperial wedding of the crown prince and princess, now emperor and empress, was broadcast on TV for 15 million viewers, cementing the domestication of television. As Yoshimi Shunya's research shows, television was initially something that took place outside, gaito terebi, and only gradually came to be domesticated in new living spaces. Good Morning is actually full of these spaces. It has a very strange kind of architectural dimension to it. I can't get into it too much at the time, but I just want to point out this kind of confluence of new spaces, of new media, of television, of protest. Although Ozu's film takes place in this strange kind of setup, and it's not in a danshi, it might remind us of those new spaces. The architectural historian Hara Takeshi, for example, has written of the ways that these new living spaces of danshi apartment buildings are invisible in post-war historiography. He points out that often when we think about the post-war, we put it in these kind of big terms and huge events, right? Like the Ampo protest would be one of them, of course. The Yodogo hijacking would be another, the Mishima incident, the Asama Mountain Lodge incident. These are the things that sort of direct and give shape to our idea of what the post-war is and its politics. But what he says is that, he says, from this perspective, danshi, the new kind of apartment buildings, which appear utterly calm on the surface, completely slip away, as if the visible assemblage of private homes were cordoned off in some fortress called personal life. However, insofar as danshi were presided over by the crown prince and princess, and insofar as they were also indicative of the latest American lifestyles, they did have a close connection with problems of sovereignty at the time, both in terms of Japan and the US, even though this is not usually discussed in terms of the conflicts that were going on. And one thing that Hara focuses on that's really interesting is the development of new cylindrical locks. And what they did was they, according to his reading, they established a new kind of privacy, which I think in some ways we can think about as a kind of security as well, especially with the idea of lock. he associates that with new American lifestyles that were really seductive for many people and were part of these new spaces. But I want to draw on the sense of a lock as well, because a lock is very important and no small thing. The first picture to grace Ariola Azule's remarkable book, The Citizenship of Photography, is that of a broken lock, held up by someone who looks directly at the camera. And this is what sparks her entire reflection of her book, which tries to understand photography as a democratic event and as a mode or a kind of civil contract, right, for people especially who are not protected by sovereignty, right? And this is what she writes. The question, why are they looking at me, has enabled me to rethink the civic space of the gaze and our interrelations with it. Both the photographer's vantage point and the process of watching photographs have emerged as only one component within a whole, very complex fabric of relations. Within its weave, the photograph subject's act of addressing the spectator bears decisive weight. She says, the photograph subjects of numerous photographs participate actively in the photographed act and view both this act and the photographer facing them as a framework that offers an alternative, albeit weak, to the institutional structures that have abandoned and injured them, that continue to shirk responsibility towards these subjects and refuse to compensate them for damages. For Azoulay, the photograph itself is a democratic event and civil contract, but only insofar as it can't be returned to some kind of sovereignty. That is to say, not the sovereignty of the state, not the sovereignty of the director, not the sovereignty even of the photographed. The only thing that has sovereignty in a way is the image itself. It constitutes a kind of refuge that would be maybe outside of security or outside of sovereignty. This is not some kind of a heroic claim, but something that in fact is really, really difficult. Although the example she uses is one of active participation, not all of her examples are that way. She chooses the word contract specifically for its legal resonance, and of course we can think of Hobbes, whom she cites directly. She eschews all terms of emotional appeal like empathy or sympathy. We don't have this kind of connection because of the way that we feel. Instead, the image itself has to set up almost a legal kind of relationship. But can we wholly exclude such feeling when we encounter the photograph? And her attention is specifically on those who are on the edge of disaster. I'm going to draw this, and I'll thank Marcus for this. This is one example that we can draw from Kame Fumio's very famous 1939 documentary, Tatakao Heitai, Fighting Soldiers, that's on the front of his book. Which is about the war in China. And we get these scenes of destruction and this gaze outward, and then another gaze coming at us like this, right? We can also draw similarly on this idea of sort of providing a refuge for people on the edge of disaster from Chris Marker's Level 5, which focuses on the very end of the war. And it's about Okinawa specifically and the mass suicides there and in Saipan. And what he does in this scene, it's a really complex film in terms of the way that it weaves many, many different media together. But in this scene, he's going to look at video from a museum of suicides.
Avec une grenade, là où l'armée avait donné des grenades, avec un bâton quand il n'avait pas de grenade. Ou alors, en se jetant dans le vide, comme avant eux, les femmes de Saipan. J'avais déjà vu ces images. Au ralenti, on voit mieux cette femme qui se retourne, qui voit la caméra. Est-ce qu'on est sûr qu'elle aurait sauté si au dernier moment, elle n'avait pas compris qu'elle était vue?
Pause it. The camera follows this woman closely. She is quite literally on the edge of disaster. With this voiceover and context, the viewer in this case becomes complicit, perhaps, with her death. She feels urged on, as if she would let the viewer down if she did not, in fact, jump. This is, of course, pure speculation. We have no idea what she was thinking. All we have is this image of her looking back. When she looks back, what does she see? What do we see? What kind of contract is this? We have no easy response, even removed today. The power of such dynamic stasis may be in its ability to arrest us and to make us ask, what does it mean to be on the edge of disaster? Such cinematic reciprocity is not without contest, however. Anat Pick has recently written a book on vulnerability in what she calls creaturely poetics. And I want to come back to this image that I used earlier from Chris Marker's Sans Soleil and look at the image that comes after it.
He used to write to me. The Sahel is not only what is shown of it when it is too late. It's a land that drought seeps into like water into a leaking boat. The animals resurrected for the time of a carnival in Bissau will be petrified again, as soon as a new attack has changed the savannah into a desert. This is a state of survival that the rich countries have forgotten, with one exception. You win, Japan. My constant comings and goings are not a search for contrasts. They're a journey to the two extreme poles of survival.
Okay. So can we call this a looking back? In Pick's case, what she wants to emphasize is a kind of bodily connection. She's almost the opposite of Azule in this regard, who concentrates on contracts and legal elements. Pick wants to refuse all kind of conscious ideas and think about how we share a sense of vulnerability, not just with humans, but with all living things. She draws from Simone Weil's statement, the vulnerability of precious things is beautiful because vulnerability is a mark of existence, and then proceeds to explore this claim. However, she refuses that idea of cinematic reciprocity completely. And what she writes is that as humans, we invest the gaze of our fellows with reciprocity and response, but the investment entails always a desire and a leap of faith. In other words, love. This plea for reciprocity is at the heart of a liberal humanist ethics based on a relationship of exchanged looks. The other gains entry into the moral fold by returning a look. This is a dynamic of power that yields to the power of looking back. It is, she says, at bottom, a narcissistic ethic that requires that I be looked at, acknowledged by the other who will then be deemed a subject. She argues that ethics takes place in the absence of the mutuality of looking, compassion in the one who looks precisely in the absence of a returned gaze. For Pick, ethics, not justice, is blind. But while she's very attentive, for example, to the mediations of technology elsewhere in the book, here in that discussion of reciprocity, there is no sense of mediation, there is no sense of a camera, there is no sense of technology at all. This is what winds up turning it into a kind of form of narcissism. The refusal of reciprocity as a basis of ethics is clear and perhaps fair if it returns us to that. But what if it does not? How do we account for the sense of immediacy and vulnerability at an intuitive level while also accounting for the layers of mediation at work? I want to close with two final examples that might complicate this relationship further. This is the first one, the emperor's recent desire to abdicate speech. What's curious about this, in a way, is that, in fact, as you may have heard, just a week ago, maybe a week and a half ago, Abe Shinzo, the prime minister, right, fired the person who was responsible for allowing the emperor to speak directly to the people. Right? I find this extraordinary. And the reason that he did this was the person's name, incidentally, was Kazuoka Noriyuki, 70 years old, and was the head of the Imperial Household Agency. He was replaced, and he was held responsible for this. The Abe administration was supposedly displeased with the emperor's expression of his desire to abdicate. The administration believes that the emperor has no freedom to voluntarily step down under the Constitution. I don't even really know how to begin to talk about that statement. There's so many ways in which the kind of mediation of sovereignty is complicated by this. When we look at this kind of image, how do we understand sovereignty? Why was this such a threat to Abe, for example, that the emperor might speak directly? I couldn't help recall Oshima Nagisa's very famous essay, The Defeated Have No Images, from the mid-1970s, in which he talks about the fact that at the end of the war, when the emperor made his announcement, what's important about it is that he did it on radio, and that there were no images of it. If there had been images, he says, they would have possibly rendered him human, where the technology of radio makes him sound completely inhuman and kind of robotic. As is often the case, I think Oshima seemed prophetic on this account. We're still living in the shadow of that. I'll leave this just for 1 second. Since someone could look directly at us and we might not look back at them. My last image comes, it's one of my favorites from scenes from all of Japanese film. It's from Shimizu Hiroshi's Blind Masseurs and a Woman, or The Masseurs and a Woman. And in this scene, Takamine Miyako is this woman from Tokyo, and she's taking refuge in this kind of resort in the mountains, far removed from the city. She's taking refuge because her patron, who is a police officer, importantly, is this threat to her and this kind of source of violence, potentially. This is 1938. There's no fighting that we see, but I think that this is very much a war image. Absolutely. And what's curious about it is, as you'll see in a second, the perspective that we have of her is the perspective of someone who can't see, a blind masseur. So this is a really complicated scene, I think, in a number of ways, even as it's a very simple scene. The sound drops out, putting almost all the emphasis on what we see. Whose perspective is this? He turns back and forth, right, and is supposedly blind. Sometimes it seems as if it's his perspective, sometimes not. There might be a sort of semi-subjective camera, this kind of term that can be used. But what happens in this? Perhaps we experience how it might be to be seen without seeing. We're not relegated to a position of victimhood or the violence of the gaze. There is violence, certainly, the violence of the world and of her patron, the police, but it doesn't necessarily seem to intervene in this relationship, even though in some ways it makes it possible and necessary to have this kind of encounter. In this case, as in others, the film does not hesitate to call out violence. At the same time, it exposes our own presence, not in the vein of enlightening or awakening us, but merely in making us an inevitable part of the scene to which we bear witness. Such an orientation redirects the panopticism of cinema or media images to expose us. This is at the heart of engaging our sense of exposure, vulnerability, and addressability. In this scene, however, while panopticism might be reversed, we find ourselves, in fact, back where we started. We are being watched without knowing it. We are being seen. What do we do with this? There is no attempt to reveal some kind of world of surveillance or anything else. The scene just makes us keenly, intensely aware of a tension and threat that exists just off screen, without any intention to tear down the screen or remove the mask. It only allows us to share in it momentarily. It's far from the end or any kind of liberation. It's only the beginning. And I'll stop there.